All right. So how about we get started? We'll let people cycle in as they join. This is kind of a flexible format, so feel free to hop in whenever. This will be recorded and posted. If not on this link, I'll share a link later and on our Prickly Pear website. So feel free to watch it, record it later if you missed anything or you have to tune out for some reason. So thank you all for coming. Hello, my name is Blake Sexton. I'm the Big Sky Watershed Corps member with Prickly Pear Land Trust this year. So kind of my job at Prickly Pear Land Trust for my 1 year Big Sky Watershed Corps term of service is as the education coordinator with the organization. And what the education coordinator and the education program at Prickly Pear Land Trust is this program where we work with local high school students and bring them out into the field. So really connecting them with the work that Prickly Pear does in the greater Helena community, getting high school students interested. Hopefully we have a handful of high school students on right now, interested in conservation and hopefully learning about some fun things. So usually we'd be out in the field with high schoolers having a lot of fun, tromping around on the rivers and collecting samples and hiking around. But under current circumstances, a digital format will have to do. But I thank you all for joining. A little background on me. I chose this subject in particular, work background in a lot of work background in flood resilience and disaster resilience. So the past 3 years or so, I have done work with the EPA in DC doing coastal resilience after Hurricane Harvey and Maria back in 2017. And then for the last 2 years, worked with the state of Montana to develop a resilience planning document to address flood and wildfire resilience in the state of Montana, and kind of fell in love with the state and have stayed since. So I'm excited here to kind of teach you all about what I've learned and come to love about open space preservation as it relates to this idea of flood resilience and how the work that Prickly Pear Land Trust ties into this greater idea of protecting our community from natural disasters. So I look forward to kind of sharing what I've learned in the past years with you all. So before we get started, we got a little bit of housekeeping to do. Oh, perfect. Yeah, looks like some people have already figured out the comment section. So then, thanks for using that. I was going to mention that. So we have the comment section. It works just like YouTube comments. Again, like webinars are usually supposed to be about, a couple presenters over the hour, but it's just me. So it'd be great if we got some comments rolling on the comment section, and I can kind of add that into my conversation as we go. That'd be fantastic. And then another note is that there is a survey link in the description. So we actually have a Prickly Pear Land Trust hat, so some cool gear to give away. So if you take that survey, it'd help a ton for my reporting needs, and we'll put you in the drawing for a free hat. So that's kind of a win-win. But yeah, I encourage you all to use the comment section. Thank you, Quickly and Mass Miner for doing so already. Yeah, other than that, let's dive into what we're going to be learning about today. So kind of my favorite way of learning is starting really high and then diving into the specific. In school is always the kind of thing where you always ask, where will I use this in real life? And this presentation is really going to start super high on the conceptual level of where we usually are in learning, and then really dive into our own neighborhood, our own backyard, and hopefully learn some things where you're going to use these things in real life and how you can use the information here to really view your world and community in a different way, hopefully. So we're going to start off for the first 10 minutes or so with establishing this idea of what is a watershed. So we'll start very high level and slowly move in from there. After that, we'll kind of go into within the watershed, what's the floodplain and what's the importance of floodplains within the watershed? What are some impacts we're seeing on the floodplain and within the watershed in recent years over a changing landscape? What are some of the changes we're seeing? And then we're going to dive into, okay, with this knowledge, with our knowledge of watersheds, floodplains, how development and climate change are affecting floodplains, what's the importance of open space in the coming century for the community? And then finally, we're going to we're going to kind of wrap things up with a story about what Prickly Pear is doing specifically to increase flood resilience in the Helena community. So really bringing it home and bringing it to a project in our own backyard where you can see how this kind of what we're learning in this presentation really comes to play with the work that we're doing at Prickly Pear Land Trust. Perfect. And again, ask questions as they come up. I'd love to loop them into the presentation as we go. Perfect. So watershed moment, a watershed moment, kind of a funny idiom that kind of references this idea of this moment in someone's life where everything changed, this defining moment. And I think understanding fully your watershed and the context of the importance of the watershed and the scale of the watershed is kind of this watershed moment and how you conceptualize your environment and conservation in your community and the importance of conservation in your community. So essentially, what a watershed is this region of land that drains water into a specific body of water. So we can start off by looking at this image on the bottom right. We have 3 distinct small-scale watersheds. And here you can see each watershed has this differing elevation. So it's usually this high elevation area, so surrounded, or this low elevation area surrounded by high elevation areas such as these mountain ridges. And what a watershed is this catchment area. So it's this area where if water falls on this high elevation area, it's going to go down to this low elevation area and stay in this body of water. So watersheds are usually defined by their lowest point. They're usually defined by either the stream or the lake at the lowest elevation. For example, this could be, let's call it the Snake River watershed. Let's see, we're in Wyoming. We have the Snake River watershed. Since this is the Snake River, let's pretend this whole area around this would be the Snake River watershed. All the land surrounding the Snake River, that's higher elevation and the water will drain into as it falls on the land, is the watershed of that water body. For example, we can say this is a different watershed. This could be the, let's say it's the 10 Mile Creek in Helena. So this is the 10 Mile Creek. All the water in this area, let's imagine this is Helena. If the water lands on this area around 10 Mile Creek, it'll drain into the 10 Mile Creek, and all that whole area is the 10 Mile Creek watershed. So essentially, watersheds can be thought of as these upside down umbrellas on a super large scale. So you have the kind of high areas of the umbrella, or the large high elevation mountainous regions. Low elevations would be kind of a lake in the middle. So it's kind of fun to think about watersheds in this context, but just at a much higher, much larger scale than obviously an umbrella. So it's kind of fun, a question. So where is the watershed? If you're standing anywhere, you can say, I am in the watershed. The watershed is everywhere. Everywhere in the world is at one of these points of elevation. Let's say your house is on this low-lying area here, for example. Anywhere you are in the world, you are in one of these drainage areas of the watershed. Even if you're in this large paved city, that city's water eventually drains into a watershed. It is in the watershed, and it eventually drains into a centralized stream or a water body. So that's an important fact to notice, especially when we think about the idea of pollution. So if the watershed is everywhere, and you have, let's say, pollutants on the surface of any surface. Let's say you have oil dripping on the roads. You have, let's say, animal wastes from agriculture production, livestock production. That is all within the watershed. So as water falls on these areas and it's drained into the centralized body, pollution anywhere within the watershed, on the surface of the watershed, is eventually going to make its way to the water body. So it's important to think about watersheds in this large scale context, because it really makes you think about the pollution within your system. And we'll dive into that a bit more as we move on. And another thing I want you guys to keep in mind as we move on talking about watersheds and floodplains is this idea of impermeable versus permeable surfaces. I'm sure these are terms you've heard of before, but I'll do a quick recap. So an impermeable surface is essentially a surface that cannot be permeated by water, while a permeable surface, as the name implies, is able to be permeated by water. So for example, let's imagine you filled a cup up with sand, a plastic cup, and poked holes in the bottom of this plastic cup and poured the water through. The water of a sand cup would run right through the sand and drain out the bottom of that cup. That would be called a permeable surface, since a sand or a soil surface that is very easily drained and water runs through, or at least can soak in, is a permeable surface. On the other hand, you have an impermeable surface. So let's imagine you filled that same cup with concrete. Let's say you just dump some concrete in a cup, and then you tried pouring water over top of that cup, or full of hardened concrete. The water would just roll right off, not sink into the surface, and get all over the floor or wherever you are. So that's also an important factor to think of when you're thinking about the watershed, is that the watershed is made up of both permeable surfaces such as grasses or soils and sands, but also impermeable surfaces such as concretes or pavements that human development has put down, or things like houses or buildings, or either really compacted soil also naturally occurs in nature. So impermeable surface isn't always human built, but usually when we talk about flooding, we're talking about impermeable human development. So I'm going to move on to the next slide. So we've learned about watersheds on the large scale. Now we're going to learn about some watersheds in our own backyard. So this is a link that I have put into the description of the video if you guys want to follow along at home. It's kind of a super fun website to look at and help you imagine watersheds. So I'll pull that up real quick. Perfect. So you're going to get to this modelmywatershed.com landing page. On this page, I already have Helena pulled up, but you can zoom into Helena. And then it kind of prompts you. You can select the area of the watershed that you would like to use. So for this, I can go over the different types of watershed, I guess, sizes and types. So we start off, you can select boundaries. So these are predetermined boundaries from USGS. So you have the HUC 8, HUC 10, HUC 12. And essentially what this is the larger the number it is, the smaller the watershed we have. Actually, I'm going to click off this real quick. So I guess just looking at Helena first before we get started, you can kind of make some guesses about where our larger watershed's going to be, right? So as we know that watersheds are defined by the lowest elevation by their body of water. Here we have Canyon Ferry and the Missouri River and Lake Helena. So we can assume that this watershed is going to be defined by this low elevation accumulation of water. And you can also see that it is surrounded by all these high elevation areas. So Helena is kind of in this valley of mountains. So as water falls down on these mountains, it runs down through these creeks and rivers and streams into these larger river, the Missouri River, which make up this larger watershed. So kind of just using the tools we learned generally about watersheds earlier, you can apply those tools and really just look at a map and kind of assume where a watershed's going to be. So let's start off with a HUC 8, so it's a hydrologic unit code, not super important, but this is the largest size they offer on Model My Watershed, creek watershed that runs into this larger watershed. So within Helena, we have a couple main creeks. 10 Mile Creek, which supplies a lot of our water. Prickly Pear Creek are two of the main ones in Helena. But it's important to look at here is that these watersheds, these smaller watersheds, are all contained within the boundary of the larger Upper Missouri watershed. So what this is that these smaller watersheds all drain into the larger watershed, and that's a pattern that we can see continue as you go up on these hydrologic unit code sizes. So we can go to the 12 real quick to see within the 10 Mile Creek. It gets really specific. So within the 10 Mile Creek watershed, you have these other watersheds. So you have the lower 10 Mile Creek, middle, and upper. And then if we go back to HUC 10, you'll see that these follow the same. These three together are the HUC 10 size 10 Mile Creek watershed. So the smaller watersheds drain into bigger ones. And this goes on for a while. As you can see, there's a ton of smaller watersheds in the area. So I encourage you guys to play around with that on your own time. A super fun way to visualize water in your system. And then I'm going to do one more thing. So we're going to go back to the HUC 8, and then we're going to go back to the Upper Missouri. So another great thing you can do with this site is you can look at some stats about the local watershed. So you can see the different size of streams within the watershed. So watersheds are made up of a variety of streams. You can see what are the different sizes of these streams. You can see the different land types. So this Upper Missouri watershed, within this, we have a lot of forests in the mountains and then grasslands in the valley area. You can see soil types. So this goes back to permeability. High infiltration is permeable soil, very slow infiltration, impermeable surface. And this is likely because the watershed contains a relatively high amount of urban area, so a decent bit of pavement in the watershed. So it's very slow infiltration. You see higher and more urban areas. Terrain, you can see slope. These aren't super interesting. So then point sources, this is, again, we talked about pollution. The pollution we talked about earlier with the pollution all over the surface of the watersheds and non-points pollution, which we can talk about in a sec. But the other type of pollution is point source pollution, which is, you can think of as a pipe of chemicals going into the river, essentially. So you can get permits. Companies can get permits through the EPA to pollute to a certain extent. And we won't get too far into the details, but I think it's fun to look at this point source page. If you look at these, NIPDs is the permit from the EPA, but if you look at this super high one from Helena, it's usually the wastewater treatment facility gets a permit to release some pollutants into the waterway at a healthy level. So that's an interesting thing to look at if you're interested in water quality. On your own time, want to do some research. Some great information there. And then going back away from point source pollution to non-point source pollution, which involves just having pollutants on the surface throughout the watershed. And then when the rain falls, it drains it all into the water body. That's non-point source pollution. And these might come from things like livestock production, from phosphates and nitrogen and things like that. But just another interesting tool that I encourage you to play around with. I have a lot of fun looking at the different watersheds, but I might just be kind of nerdy, so we'll see. We'll see if other people have fun. Perfect. So, and then keeping kind of what we've learned in mind, let's continue moving in the presentation. So if you have kind of that HUC 8 larger upper Missouri river watershed in mind. And keep that in mind. And then I'll tell you, this is a Huck 2 map. So the 10 here is the full Missouri watershed. So as we saw as we move up or into larger scales of the hydrologic unit code, watershed areas, they kind of feed into larger watersheds. And this is the next level up, which is the largest watershed at this level in the country. It contains most all of Montana. And what's important to know about this is that the choices that we make in the headwaters here of the Missouri River really have a huge impact on the water quality downstream. So when thinking about watersheds in this large context, you can really, it really just helps to know that every choice you make within your localized watershed has a larger impact downstream, even throughout the country. I mean, we get down to Missouri. And then one final note is, if we even expand out further, you have the continental divide. And from what we know and have learned so far about differing elevations and low points of water defining watershed, the continental divide is also an example of a delineation of a watershed boundary at a very large scale. So essentially all the water that falls on this side of the continental divide eventually drains its way into the Atlantic Ocean over there, and all the water that falls on this side eventually drains its way into the Pacific. It's just fun to note when switching back to the Huck 2 watersheds, you can see the line of the continental divide is the same. So you can kind of trace that, and just a fun way to imagine just how different scale watersheds work together. And I won't belabor watersheds anymore, but I think it's really important context to have when we dive into floodplains and more specific hydrologic study areas. So now, without further ado, let's dive into floodplains again. Oh, okay, one sec. I saw a question. Does the East Helena slag pile pose a pollution problem? Oh, so yeah, I'll hold off on talking about that for right now. Maybe later we can touch on it a bit. But it is EPA, is working with that as a pollution potential. Yep. It's under recovery. So we're going to move on to floodplains. So this photo here, I encourage you to put on your watershed scientist hat on and try to find where the watershed is and think about the different elevations and how water drains through this from what we've learned. And from that, and kind of an interesting, important fact we want to look at here is this marked area on this image of this localized watershed being the floodplain. So I picked this because of exactly this, the prior courses of the Parana River. So overall, this is all the watershed of the Parana River. This is the watershed maybe of the Verde River, but within the Parana River watershed contains the Verde River watershed, as we've learned from scales of watershed. And an important factor of this one is looking at the prior courses of the Parana. This is where the water historically flowed through there, and I think it's really nice that you can see where the water used to be. And I also think it makes an important visualization and argument for what a floodplain is and what the function of a floodplain is within a watershed. So this is going to be the watershed feature that we're focusing on in this presentation. So a floodplain is essentially an area within a watershed that is designed to naturally flood, which is simple enough. So a floodplain is rivers during either spring runoff or high water events. Rivers naturally are going to overflow their natural course and leak into an area outside their normal streamway. And in this area that regularly is inundated with water from excess stream flow is the floodplain. And floodplains are very interesting features of the landscape. Uh, it's this low-lying ground adjacent to the river. Um, and it's really interesting because when you look at a floodplain, you can see all these plants and life that have evolved to live within this context of constant inundation with water. So all the plants within the floodplains have developed um, under these conditions, and they're really good at living in very wet conditions, and they're very good at, taking up a lot of this water. So the natural function of this floodplain is to store the excess water and nutrients during the high flow events. So with all this water and nutrients coming to this area, the plants in this area do take up a lot of these nutrients and are oftentimes very healthy. Which again, why I like this photo so much is why you see a lot of agricultural land historically near the floodplain. So since all this water historically within human history, civilization built up around the floodplain to capture these nutrients and this water, because it's such fertile land. So kind of a difficult thing you have to deal with when talking about floodplains is like, it's the floodplain. That's bad, right? No, the floodplain is not bad at all. The floodplain is good. It's the way humans interact with the floodplain sometimes that is bad. So the floodplain is great. This is a photo here of the Nile River in Egypt. Kind of the start of human civilization came from this floodplain area. And I love this photo because you can see, again, this area that is inundated with water and nutrients, the floodplain, within the context of this larger desert area, and how fruitful and vibrant this small strip of land is. So floodplains are not bad. In fact, civilization was born from floodplains. They relied, early agriculture society relied on the semi-regular flooding of these large rivers in Mesopotamia for food and sustenance. So humans really have a lot to thank floodplains for, and it's hard to say that floodplains are bad. It's just the fact that modern society does not live with floodplains the same way that ancient society did, and with that we run into some issues. So with that in mind, we can take a look at one modern society and how we are living within our floodplain. So this is going to be Helena. We can dive into what Helena's floodplain looks like and how we live with it. Great. So this is the FEMA's website. So FEMA is the Federal Emergency Management Administration, and it administers a program known as the National Flood Insurance Program. I won't get into the specifics of this, but they are essentially the government agency that's responsible for mapping out floodways or flood maps for communities to assess their flood risk. So this is a great website, super fun thing to look at and play around. So you can look up your house in here and see if you're in the floodplain, and you can learn more about your risks. So I think it's something that everybody should have access to. Everybody should know about how to assess the risk and whether they're in the floodplain or what their community's floodplain looks like. So in the Helena community, we can zoom out a bit more. Sorry about all the green. It's from just the way the data is presented. But you can zoom back. We can see the Missouri River and Canyon Ferry up in the north. And then we see, again, the valley. And similar to the Nile photo, kind of, that we saw earlier, you see this area around the river that is agricultural land and is really being irrigated by this bodies of water. So as we dive in to the Helena community, we can get closer and closer, and we're going to go back a step. So this is the 10 Mile Creek that we saw the watershed of the 10 Mile Creek earlier as it was kind of the southern edge of town into town. So we're looking at the 10 Mile Creek watershed for some context. And as we move in here, whoa, we got some color, right? And this is an important stage. I won't go too much into detail here, but we'll learn about kind of three important elements of this map. So the colors we really care about on this map are the blue hatched pattern, and the orange. You can ignore all the rest. We can go as far as we want into all these flood maps, but a lot of these are used for engineers to assess flood elevations and other flood hydrology information. But for our purpose, what's important on this map is primarily this hatched blue and red pattern in the blue area and the orange area. So those are the floodplain, more or less. So the hatched area is the floodway. So this is the area under conditions of a high flow event where the water is designed to go within a floodplain. So we have here, you can zoom in, you can see it follows the path of the river pretty closely, but also leaves a bit. And we can talk about what that is, why it leaves the path a bit when we talk about the blue area. So the blue area, this is known as, this is the floodplain. So this is an area that is designed to be naturally and regularly flooded and is commonly populated with floodplain localized species that we'll talk about later. But for the purpose of FEMA's maps, this is known as the 100-year floodplain. And just a kind of a fun fact so you guys know about when people talk about different types of floods. The 100-year floodplain refers to the area within the watershed that is statistically prone to flooding at a 1% chance every year. So they call it the 100-year floodplain because after 100 years of 1% chances, there's a 100% chance that there will be a flood in this area. So that's how the engineers kind of designed it, the language. The 500-year floodplain, again using the same logic, is 0.2% annual chance of flooding in the area, and then over 100 years, that's over 500 years, that's 100% chance of flooding in this area. So, I mean, if you live in the Helena Valley and have, or live in the Helena community, you know that it has flooded more than once in the past 100 years, or even the past 10 years in these areas. So definitely should not be taken by face value by these terms, but generally it's good to know that these colored areas are the floodplain in your community. So it's an important thing to look at when we're looking at this floodplain is what do we see in this floodplain as compared to maybe the floodplain of the Parana River or the Nile. And I hope you guys are all looking kind of over here at this development, and the floodplain's actually following these roads because that's where the water will go. And it's the existence of houses. It's the existence of impermeable surface and human development within this floodplain that, as we know by definition of a floodplain, is an area that is designed hydrologically to regularly be inundated with water. So that's an interesting fact of recent human development. Though humans have always developed within the floodplain for agriculture purposes, historically, modern development looks a lot different than historic development. So modern development, we see a lot of impermeable concrete development in the floodplain, which has a lot of different effects on the floodplain and the greater area of the watershed. So I think this is an important, I like this area of the map because it shows importantly how human development shapes the floodplain and how impermeable surfaces really redefine the floodplain. So if you look here on these roads, the development of these houses in their very nature restructure the way that water moves through the floodplain. Prior to these houses being developed, imagine this was just grasslands here. The 500-year, the orange area would probably have cut off around here, as we see on this other side with more open area. But with the existence of impermeable surfaces, the water runs over these roads and runs through these houses and sidewalks and can't really soak into the ground. So it really increases the size of the floodplain of the community. So, and we'll talk about that in a sec. But it's just really interesting to look at the way human development has changed in what we see in the floodplain compared to historic. So, yeah, I encourage you all to look at this on your own time. Find your house, see if you're in the floodplain, talk with your family about what that means, or yeah, if they even know. I know a lot of people don't even know they're in the floodplain, which is something we can discuss as well, why that is. So with this kind of a great segue into development trends. So as we saw in Helena, the floodplain in Helena goes through the Helena community, so the developed Helena area. And this is something we've seen. This is not something unique to Helena. It's something that Helena's done bad. It's just something that is happening everywhere in the world, actually. So it's going back to, as we touched on, this idea of impermeable versus permeable surfaces. Again, just rehashing what we talked about. If you look at this picture here, they built the roads and their houses in the floodplain. The increased amount of impermeable surface increases the amount of water that just can't soak in and pools up, as you see here. And if you had, let's say, imagine this was all a field, the floodwaters would probably not have even reached this far and would have soaked into the ground. And we'll talk about how open space does that in a sec. So not only does impermeable surface and development in the floodplain increase the floodplain, naturally, if you put your house in an area that's designed to flood, it puts your house at risk. But as we also have discussed, if you put impermeable surfaces within the floodplain, it increases the size of the floodplain. So the water has to go somewhere. So if it's impermeable, it's going to find an area to soak in. So it also increases your neighbor's risk. So it's kind of this really terrible feedback loop of as you increase the number of houses in a floodplain, you increase the size of the floodplain, and that increases the houses in the floodplain as well. So again, it increases your neighbor's risk. It destroys downstream conditions, which we'll talk about with channelization in a sec. But first, and it also destroys site habitat. So if you imagine this has all kind of open space with these trees, you can imagine a lot of happy animals living in this very nutrient-rich area of the watershed. So it kind of destroys a lot of the site habitat. And then, again, destroys downstream conditions. So this primarily happens through stream channelization, and I'm going to show you an extreme example of stream channelization. It doesn't all look like this, but this is my very extreme example, which is actually fairly common. So development around a waterway can look like this. So this is called channelization, when you force a stream into a route that it does not naturally take. And this is, again, a very extreme impermeable surface channelization. So what this channelization does is it really it speeds up the river. So the river, if it was in open space, just a natural river, you see like turns in the river, right? You see it's eroding the banks of the river, and it's slowly meandering through the ecosystem, and the soils on the side soak up the water as it does so. But in this context of an impermeable channelization of the river, these banks are not soaking up any water. When there's a high flow event, all this water is going to go shooting down the river, and where it finally does end up out of the channel, that area is going to be extremely prone to flooding. So we see things like hard infrastructure like this, concrete, either channels or levees to stop water. And we've seen a lot of terrible human disasters from this hard, impermeable development in the floodplain. to control water in recent history. Katrina is a great example of that. And again, ask questions if you have any questions. I don't mean to blow through all of this, but yeah, please ask some questions. So perfect. So we've learned about development trends as kind of trends affecting the watershed or the floodplain from a human development standpoint. And now we're going to talk really briefly about climate trends and how those are going to affect the floodplain in the future. So if you haven't heard of the Montana Climate Assessment, I'd highly encourage you all to search that on the internet. It's a great document that really does a really in-depth run through of the climate trends we've historically seen in Montana and are predicted to see in the coming century. So essentially, one of the big takeaways of that is we are seeing a general warming in Montana of the climate, and we will see a general warming for the century to come. And it's hard to tell what the impact of this warming will have on water specifically, just because water systems are so dynamic, but we do know it will have an effect on these systems. And I won't get too in depth to this, but if anybody has any specific questions, I'm happy to answer them. But generally, the context of this is important to note is that within the current system of human development, having this relatively rapid change in the way water works in the new ecosystem under a warmer climate, the watershed and the floodplain don't have time to naturally react. So under normal climate conditions, the nature can kind of slowly adapt to the new conditions and evolve with the changing conditions. But under the conditions of human development and climate change, nature doesn't have time to adapt and control and grow with the flooding. So these are some real challenges we're facing the floodplain. But don't worry, we've kind of gone through the last 15 minutes we'll spend, unless there's some questions, going through what are some solutions we're working on to these problems of development in the floodplain and flooding. What's the best way forward? And that is, as we've kind of touched on, open space. So by preserving open space in the floodplain, there are many benefits that we see. So this photo here is a photo of a riparian ecosystem, which is a fancy way of saying the ecosystem surrounding the river or within the floodplain generally. And some of the common, as we mentioned again, common plants that have evolved to endure in these high moisture environments include cottonwood, cottonwood and red willow. So you can see the red willow down below and the cottonwood up above. So these are really moisture-loving plants that do a great job of soaking up excess water. Again, going back to the basic function of a floodplain to store excess water and nutrients. They do a really great job of soaking up this excess water and nutrients. They also do a great job of stabilizing the banks of the streams. So we'll talk about that a bit during the 7 Mile restoration, but what these plants do is the root structures, as they grow along the stream banks, hold that soil in place to prevent erosion. So as a stream kind of meanders through an ecosystem and it hits those banks of the river, the roots of these plants are really holding the soil in place to prevent the channelization, natural channelization that we saw with that concrete example. That'll happen naturally without the existence of this vegetation, which we'll see at a specific example in a second. But also within the context of water quality, so with pollution, these plants do a great job of filtering out a lot of the pollutants we see draining into our waterways. So again, this root structure surrounding the river, as water runs into this lowest point on the watershed, into this water body, these root structures really suck up all the nutrients, the excess nutrients that are making its way, or the pollutants that are making their way into the waterway. And they do a really good job of naturally filtering water in our watershed. And lastly, permeability. So open space, as opposed to impermeable development, like concrete, open space absorbs the water, soaks it up like a sponge, and can really hold the water. So during a high flow event, all the water goes over this area, and essentially this area catches it all like a sponge. It soaks it all up and holds it there. It does a really good job of not letting it get to human development. So with that, I think we have enough to kind of dive into a specific example of what Prickly Pear Land Trust is doing within the context of flood resilience and open space preservation in the Helena community. So this project is a 7 Mile Creek restoration, which is a parcel of land north of town near Birdseye. And so this area we have here is, as we mentioned, with channelization, this is a more or less natural channelization of the river. They didn't use impermeable channelization, but they did channelize the river. So what happened was the prior owner of this parcel ended up digging a new stream channel, so it channelized the river, the non-natural stream channel at the edge of the property. We think this was to increase the amount of grazing. This was a ranching property, so to increase the amount of area that can be grazed. In doing this, you disconnect the river from the riparian ecosystem, from those the vegetation that really hold the bank in place, and from all that vegetation that really soaks up the water. So what we see is, you can kind of see it here, is that as the creek runs through the property, it cuts into this environment. It just keeps eroding down and down because there's no roots there to hold the soil in place. So we call this an incised channel. And by the time Prickly Pear Land Trust acquired this property, the creek was about 8 feet disconnected from the floodplain. So the floodplain, where it stands, is about 8 feet above where the creek is, making it almost impossible for the floodplain to provide functions of slowing high flow events. So kind of what Prickly Pear Land Trust did here and is currently working on finishing up is a full stream rechannelization of the 7 Mile Creek area. So this is an example. Here's an aerial photo of the stream rechannelization that we're working on. This is a portion that we've completed. We only have a little bit left of this project, and it should be done by next year. So if you can see on the right here, you can see this old stream bed, and we can see this riparian vegetation existing on the banks of the stream. And what this vegetation, as we've mentioned, it really holds the stream bank in place, and it happens naturally. Wherever there's water, you're going to end up with some vegetation around, and wherever there's water and nutrients. But it's bad because it's a really incised area, so it's still not performing its natural function. The water is just really shooting through there quick during high flow events and really potentially harming downstream properties with flooding. So what Prickly Pear Land Trust did was, to avoid channelization, is we essentially reintroduced the very beneficial factors of open space that we see in open space, including stream meanders. So this slows down the river, allowing it to overflow over the banks a bit and allow the soil on the outside of the river to really soak up a lot of that moisture and nutrients. We planted a lot of native plants, including willows, to help stabilize the stream banks. So as the water does meander and move through, it's not eroding too much at these turns, and it's not eroding on the sides. So it should stay connected to the floodplain. And essentially, what we're seeing here is, even in the last couple of years of this project being continually established, is we're seeing a lot of improvements in the local habitat. The water's slowing down, and I think a really good way of seeing the way that you're affecting an ecosystem or a natural system is by looking at these um, indicator species and the wildlife that's enjoying the area. So I think this is a good chance that if anybody has any questions that they want to talk about, geez, put them in the comments. I'll keep talking, but if a good question comes up, I'll address that instead. So thanks. So as I mentioned, with the wildlife as a good indicator, even in the past few years of having the 7 Mile Creek property really rejuvenate it, we've seen an introduction of an incredible amount of bird species, some beavers building dams in the creek potentially, just a lot of visitors from wildlife. And that's really a good sign for us that we're doing a good job to restore this habitat, to restore this floodplain ecosystem to its preferred conditions. So these are a picture of some of the species that we found on the property. It's a picture of Shane. He's our local ecologist. He studies the property and the species, flora and fauna on the property, and does a really good job of figuring out what kind of improvements we're seeing on the 7 Mile Creek property. But that's all I have for the presentation. So I'll wait a couple minutes for some questions, and if none come in, we'll wrap things up. But appreciate you guys listening. And again, please enter if you ended up listening to this presentation and enjoyed or learned something. I'd really appreciate it if you could fill out the survey attached in the comment section. We'll do a drawing, and one person will win a hat if they fill out the survey. But I'll hold off for a little bit. I guess with the East Helena Superfund site, that is something that does pose a pollution problem, but the EPA is nearing finalization of fully addressing that site. You can actually take tours of the slag pile now, and it's pretty inert, so it doesn't pose a direct threat. Recording the presentation is being recorded. It should be up on the same link following the webinar, but if it's in a different one, I'll share that on Prickly Pear's website and through emails with your teachers if you are going through the high schools. Yeah, so I guess we got a question in. I'm sure you guys can all read it. When it comes to large concrete channels like on the Mississippi, is there anything that can be done to restore those, or is the land nearby just too developed to return to the natural flow? And that's kind of an interesting fact, and something that we're working on and we have been working on at a national scale for years. Is actually, yeah, it is possible to feasibly possible to restore those ecosystems back to normal from a environmental engineering or from that kind of perspective. It's fairly idealistic. It's tough politically and economically to get the funding and cooperation. There's a lot of people who live or have businesses that would be affected by a large-scale restoration project like that. So politically, economically difficult to do. But if we had unlimited money and everybody was on board, yes, it would be possible. And it is following, let's say, large-scale flooding events, such as hurricanes, or let's say you just have a large flood on a river. you do see a lot of funding coming in from the government to do some of the projects like removing concrete channelizations and restoring natural functions of ecosystems. So it can be done, yeah.